Hi, everyone. Let's call the meeting, the ABC Administration Budget Committee to order. Hurry up. Shall we do roll call?
Director Chapman,
Here.
Director Gill,
Yeah, yeah.
Director Alexander, here.
Why not say again? God has. Why didn't I own this?
Oh, did I miss?
No, I didn't own the speaker.
I'm sorry. Director Gill.
I'm here now.
Okay, good to know everyone's here. All right. All right, at this point, is there anyone from the public that would like to comment?
There are none.
Okey-dokey. So then the first item of business is approval of the minutes. Everybody got a chance to review the minutes?
I moved.
Okay,
Second. I second.
okay, so we have a motion to approve the minutes by Director Gill and a second by Director Alexander. All right, so we do roll call.
Director Chapman,
Yes.
Director Gill,
Yes.
Director Alexander. Yes.
All right, motion to approve the minutes approved unanimously. All right. Now we are on to reviewing the proposed budget for fiscal year 2023-2024. Christina is going to give us a presentation. Take it away.
Hey, good evening, directors. We're pleased to provide the Admin and Budget Committee with the draft of the proposed budget for fiscal year 2023-2024. And tonight we'll provide a summary of the proposed budget and to answer any questions the committee may have about the budget. And the draft is included in your packet in an Excel format. So let's begin with what we estimate to have by the end of this current fiscal year, which is dated June 30th. And that we'll end up carrying over into the new year. In District 1, we project that we'll have a little over 9 million. However, of that 9 million that we will have in our fund balance, about 2 million is committed. And what that means is that's actually earmarked for our 20% funding program that's set aside and it's been allocated from previous years. And so technically for the authority's project use and expenditures, it's only about 7.1 million. Similarly, in Measure T, we expect that we would carry over a balance about 3.6 million. So far, there's nothing that's encumbered. So that would be the full amount that's would potentially be available. In Measure Q, we project that we might have an ending balance about 8.3. Of that amount, there is a $500,000 set aside. That includes that money that we've set aside for the Five Wounds project. And then in terms of for the reserve, we have a projected balance about 15.2 million. Of that amount, under the board approved reserve policy, we have set aside 14 million for operational reserves, as well as a conservation stewardship set aside of about $200,000 that we had previously set aside because it was part of a requirement set by the Land Trust Association. And so that only leaves about a little over $1 million that we estimate to be available. And as for grants, the projected ending balance, we still have about $1 million left. Those are the monies that we have received before we actually are delivering the objectives of the grant. All that entire amount actually is restricted, and it's only for those respective grant projects that were approved, and they're not to be used for anything else. So yes, Director.
I don't know if you want me to ask a question now or.
No, feel free to ask a question now while we're fresh on this page and I have the numbers in front of me too.
I'm just new to get the budget
Yeah.
intensively. And So at what point do funds move into the reserve? Like are the District One, Measure T, Measure Q funds, are those all current or are some of those carry over from a previous?
So actually, all this is carryover, but we don't commingle our funds. They're all kept separate. So for example, for District One, that 9 million, that's actually carried over from previous fiscal years where we had, it was a surplus, or we underspent our budget. So for example, we get revenues from District One of 4.2 million. We underspent that. And then basically it keeps carrying over into the following years. It does, oh,
Can I
sorry.
ask for the question, the same question? So, the reason is the carryovers, so we cannot use it or the it's already allocated in last year and then the project is underway or what's the reason?
So underspending, it could be due to delays in projects,
Carry over,
the carryover.
so what is the reason? Because or you can describe the carryover, where the carryover come from? I know the last 2 years we
Mhm.
have the budget and then cannot use it, right? Or the carryover is only for those reasons, so, or do you have anything else? That money or?
So what happens is the carryover is a cumulative of maybe a decade ago where we receive 4.2, but our expenses actually don't even get to 4.2. So that's already the building of the carryover. At this point, it's mostly driven by any delays in projects where we underspent in that specific year.
So Justina, it could be a mix.
Yes.
Some of the carryover could be not yet spent money for projects that we thought we were gonna do in 2022, 2023, and we didn't spend all that money. And some of it is money that we haven't spent from a number of years ago.
Mhm.
Oh, okay, let me understand a little bit. Okay, so whatever the money, even the day one, when the agencies start, we have some kind of money we just accumulate somewhere,
Mhm.
right? And the one part, like one part of one account there.
Yeah.
So every year we are taking some money from that, right? To fund all the projects.
In the past 3 years, yes. And the next slide, I would actually address how much carryover we intend to use in the upcoming fiscal year that we're proposing.
Okay,
But yes, I wouldn't say every year that we always use our carryover. It's only if we need it in excess of our 4.2 million.
I understand that,
Mhm.
we have to be just put on my next year's budget, our next year budget. But my real question is that, so these carryover is come from any account where are we just store somewhere whenever we need to take the money out? For like this year, we have to make the budget, right?
Mhm.
So we have to get the money from somewhere. Some is we have the revenue coming. And then we just put that revenue in some kind of account. We have that where all the money is sitting there.
Yes.
So then we just take that money whenever we want to make our budget, right?
Yes.
So you are taking that carryover from that account or whatever the budget we already did that and we cannot use them because of delay the project. So it's a combination or just one? That's my question.
It's a combination.
Okay.
And what happens is it is right now currently sitting in the county investment pool.
Okay.
This exact balance. Yeah.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Mhm.
One more.
Yes.
What is the difference between reserve and carryover? What ends up in the reserve?
Got it. So carryover is a term that we're using across all the funds, which is basically the money that's been in the surplus that we've been accumulating. The reserve is actually the name of one of our funds, and that was actually money that was that came from one of our past benefit assessments.
Yeah, so yeah, I know. How many million is that?
So currently sitting there, it's about 15 million.
It was, I know that we remember that we have around maybe 55 or something before the last week, right?
At the end of the lawsuit,
It's not 32 or something.
after everything was settled, attorney's fees were paid.
Yeah.
Those members of the public who wanted their money
Yeah.
back
were given it back. What was left was about $50 million.
50,
No, 35.
35, that's why
Yeah.
I still remember
Yeah.
30, 35.
So there was about 35 million
It's a
unrestricted
unrestricted, yeah.
when I arrived in 2011.
Yeah, on that time, I think the case was settled down, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so we used some of those monies right away to buy properties. Use some of those to hire staff. We put Measure Q on the ballot. And around that time, we brought to the board a recommendation to establish an operational reserve, rainy day fund essentially.
Yeah.
So that 15 million is that money
That,
left.
And is there an amount that we're trying to keep in that?
We're trying not to touch that for now. But that's the board's decision, what they want to do, and it factors into our cash flow, the revenues that we have coming in. So at some point, we will probably have to dip into those reserves unless we have a funding measure that it passes, in the future. Or we have other financial revenues coming in. So that's really, for the board, that's for the board's discretion.
I just didn't know if there was already some sort of, we will keep at least X amount in there or.
Yeah, the thinking at the time was and it's old thinking now, that was 2 years of operational reserve. Our annual operations is much more than that now. But it's nice to know that that's there. And then in terms of what Calvin was asking, when each year when we do the budget and Justina lets us know what the carryover is, we have a strategic internal discussion about how much of the reserve, how much of the carryover we're comfortable using.
You go to carryover first and then you go to reserve.
We usually don't use reserve, but yeah,
if it's a really necessary, if
yeah.
we don't have any funding, then the board will authorize any kind of, we can take the money from that reserve, yeah.
The silly question, so it says you bid 14,200,000, is that? I was gonna say, Justina, would you like to explain, there's I think a board policy.
Sure, which is what Andrea was referring to, the operational reserve policy. Of that 15.2 million, the board had approved to set aside the 14 million, which we have not touched, and our goal is to also try to not touch.
Okay, so not committed to, we're using it for X, but committed to a reserve.
Correct. We're committed to keeping that as a rainy day, kind of amount.
That was, yeah.
Yeah.
That'd be my next question.
I think that makes sense.
Yep.
Trying to figure out, if some things are actually committed to something, but that's actually like your floor.
Yes, yes. Yeah.
So now $23.6 million, beside that 15 million or?
Oh, so that 35 unfortunately is long gone. That 35 was the starting amount.
No. Just saying,
Oh,
here is there 23.6 million. Oh,
Yeah. Okay.
okay,
I'm a little bit faster.
okay. But sure, no problem. And actually, just to touch on Director Chapman's note about, do we use the other carryovers before we touch reserve? Each fund has its own carryover balance, and if the expense is eligible, we actually would draw from those funds first before we even tap into that reserve.
You have a hierarchy.
We indeed do. And it's always grants first because it's someone else's money. But from there, we kind of trickle down and see whatever's eligible first.
Thank you.
No problem. So again, this kind of establishes that carryover balance. What we have, think of it like this is our savings account. So now we're moving on to what's our income, and the next slide would be our budget, the expenses, and therefore any kind of gap is where we would have to withdraw from the carryover to kind of compensate and pay for those projects. In 23-24, we estimate that between District 1 benefit assessment as well as Measure T parcel tax, we will receive approximately 12.4 million in revenue. We also do have some agreements with other agencies where they would reimburse us for land management services. So that's about $180,000. And we also have agricultural leases. And so that brings in about $135,000. That brings in that revenue. And then that second subtotal you see there, that is actually what staff is proposing to withdraw from the carryover that we would need to use to help fund the projects next year and operating expenses. So as you may recall from District 1, we project that we'll have about $7 million carryover balance at the end of the year. We anticipate withdrawing about 2 million of that. Same thing similarly with Measure Q, we were looking to withdraw about 4.7. And then we're also expecting to receive some grants to fund some of the projects, as well as some interest income and some grazing lease income. And in all, the estimated revenue plus carryover that we intend to use is about 23.6 million. Is that the 23, Director Gill, that you're referring to? Yeah.
23.6 million. We already projected that 23, 23, 24. My question is that $14 million, what is our rainy money? That is a separate than that.
That is separate from that. Yep. Yeah, we are not withdrawing that to as an income this year. And so that 23.6, what will it pay for? Is what we're looking for the 23-24 budget. These are separate, categorized by our major expense categories. We've got payroll and benefits, first two lines, some travel and expenses, supplies. Supplies includes not only the office supplies, but also field operation management supplies. Outside services, other services and expenses. So there might be some fees as well as other program, but volunteer and environmental ed program expenses in there. Equipment, purchase of equipment, as well as maintenance costs of our fleet is included in the next line. And then the facilities and utilities. Utilities mainly being the costs to run the building. As well as there are some minor utilities on some of our land that might have buildings or electricity needs, electrical needs. We got some membership sponsorships, as well as then one of the large one of the larger expenses would be like the fee title for basically acquisition related costs. And then the allocation for our grant program, and that's toward the Measure T Urban Grant Program. We expect to set aside $500,000. And so that kind of covers the total expenses, a little bit under $23 million.
So we still have some savings.
A little
Yes.
bit. What happens is I tend to be a little conservative. The reason being why I don't budget exactly to the penny is sometimes our interest income might fluctuate. Our grazing lease is dependent on how much cattle is out there with our grazing partners. If they're not putting cattle out there, we're not actually, this is just an estimate based on historical data. And so if we tend to receive lower, I don't want to over budget when we're not going to receive that kind of revenue. So yes.
Is, so we're using some carryover from the Measure and District 1. Is that kind of a normal amount of carryover that we're using? Or is this an unusual?
For District 1, it's typical considering our trend now in terms of our operating costs has gone up in the past few years. It's very similar to last year's number. Measure Q carryover, the last 2 years have been extremely high because we've engaged in a lot of capital improvement projects. A lot of, for example, mine, Yakima, we budgeted quite a large amount last year and then as well as this year, as we have some conservation, the CV camp as well as Yagas Creek Day Use Area. There's just a lot of different projects going on.
Justina, could you say a little bit more about that in terms of the balance between, we're estimating capital costs, you know, for Coyote Ridge, for the day use area at Rancho, et cetera. How does the grant funding and the reimbursement fit into that?
Got it. Okay. So in terms of those projects, if they're grant funded, it would actually be reflected in that grant's income line. So for example, that 3.8, that's not all just the capital improvement ones. There's also restoration projects that are grant funded. But that Measure Q carryover, that's actually our net expense. Does that help cover the?
Yeah, well, I kind of wanted the board to understand that when we are looking at future capital projects, we are not funding those 100% ourselves out of our general fund.
It's kind of basically our match. It's our skin in the game to get more grants for the projects. Yes.
Quick question, just a general question.
Mhm.
As an agency, so do we have any kind of plan to increase the revenue or control the expense? So those kind of strategy or anything we are just going to do? Or so if you know that, can you just explain a little bit? Where we also, anything things you can increase your revenue and control or maybe reduce your expense, then maybe the agency will be in a better shape.
So in terms of our,
Or might be that is actually general question to Andrea.
well, for our revenues, I know that we're always seeking different funding mechanisms. We're pursuing some options currently as well. As for expenditures, we do, trust me, I try to keep it. I'm looking over it all the time. But you know, OpEx inflation, costs do go up. It's a little bit slightly at the whim of our vendors as they increase costs. For us, we do competitive bidding. We kind of look and reevaluate our vendors from time to time. That's our way of trying to manage costs. But at this rate, it's mostly looking at increasing revenue.
But toilet paper, I'm just giving you an example. We are doing those kind of things because the penny make a dollar, right? So we can just.
I hear you. But in terms of our numbers, if I want to look for savings, we have such big ticket items that those smaller ones, however much dent I try, it doesn't quite hit the mark.
No, I'm just saying that we should get a dollar, right?
Mhm.
So I think maybe if we can look at those kind of things. where
Yeah.
we can-
And
the agency and-
got it, will do.
I could just add to that too. So we do actually look, I know when I review the bills for payment, you can ask Elizabeth how many times I've asked what the fluctuation in our water bill or electricity bill might be. We do ask department managers to look at what their discretionary spending is gonna look like. There's certain things like we do have to pay the light bill and all that, but other things where we have choices, are we making the most economical choices? And then as Justina said too, we have competitive bidding and other techniques to try to keep the expenses down.
I think maybe, like the electricity bill, how much is should be the electricity bill? Do we look at the solar option? So we can save some money on that way, might be.
After an investment, that is true. You have to purchase it and all, and that is something that's on the plan to consider.
Yeah.
But we would have to have a significant cash outlay to do it. So we have not budgeted money to do that, but we're in the research phase.
So, do we have in any other our property, any sprinkles or those kind of stuff?
Sprinklers.
Any like the water sprinkles or?
Oh,
we have
sprinklers.
somewhere, anywhere or not in our property, right? And property.
Only here
Yeah.
and compliant with California state law.
Right,
We're only utilizing drip and not maintaining our lawn.
right,
So that's reducing some of our water costs there.
right.
But you know, anyway, I'm just saying because we have a really good technology, we just use the water, we have to be look at the soils, moisture, and then the sprinkle is automatically on if the need there, because of rain is there, then it's not. Sometimes we
Right.
can use those kind of technology, even the electricity technology is the best way to save a lot of money.
Director Gill, if I could interject this. I think we're teeing up why we're having a larger conversation about a potential ballot measure, because I think you're probably seeing the building on the fact that we're acquiring and we're doing all these things and the agency is growing and you can see that the revenue is not keeping up with the agency.
Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, of course, no problem. And so just to kind of, numbers sometimes can be overwhelming. So then always throw in a chart. So just to kind of break down the budget, about 41% is of our budget is consisted of salaries and benefits. The next biggest chunk is our capital expenditures. So going back to any type of restoration, capital improvement projects, capital purchases such as vehicles or those are also making up almost a third of our budget. And then kind of you can see also our non-discretionary operating expenses are actually kept pretty low. Generally, a rule of thumb is also like a 10% of a operating expense, but we've been keeping it pretty decent. Departments have also just projects that aren't capital projects. There's also some expenses there. And then the money that we set aside for our grant program. So just kind of a quick chart of where the money goes. And then, so how do we compare? Kind of just to give you the board, this current fiscal year is fiscal year 22-23. We are looking to propose 23-24. I'll start with the first line, which I will turn over to Elizabeth to kind of give a little breakdown of why that difference between this current fiscal year and next before I go down the list.
Good evening, directors. Officially, Elizabeth Loretto, Human Resources Officer. So as you can see here, looking at this first line, we are looking at an increase of just over $1.2 million for payroll and benefits in the planned budget for this next fiscal year. And this increase comes from three factors. So I want to just highlight what those are for you and answer any questions you might have. First, our adjustments to our staffing headcount. Our staffing approach is always focused on how to advance our mission and goals and how to best execute the specific activities we've identified in our work plan. To do this, our planned budget proposal includes new positions in conservation initiatives and grants, field operations, natural resources, and planning and capital improvements departments. So a lot of impact on the land itself and what we're doing in that aspect of our work. The grand total would be 2 full-time positions and 7 part-time positions, which would bring us to 64 regular year-round positions when fully staffed, plus 4 seasonals. The second element that contributes to this increase is our cost of living adjustment applied to wages. Historically, the authority has recommended a cost of living adjustment based on the March report of the Consumer Price Index for San Francisco, Oakland, and San Jose for the year ending in February. Last year, the recommendation was a slight modification of that, and we implemented an average of the data from February 2022 and December 2021. So this year, we are looking to move back to that model from the previous 7 years, which was the March data at face value. So that cost of living adjustment reflected in this budget is a 5.3% increase reflected on that CPI data for March of 2023. As we're aware, the rate of inflation continues to be impactful for everyday items in life. And so the intention of this model for COLA is to provide our staff with the adjustment that meets the economic impacts that they are experiencing. There have been years through this model where the COLA was a 1.4% or something like that. So it's the real time adjustment. But we know we like to look at what our friends and neighbors are doing. So we've done a little comparative research for the COLA approach implemented by some of our peer agencies. Most typically, agencies such as East Bay Regional Parks, Mid-Penn, and Santa Clara County Parks implement COLAs of 3%, not about, but exactly 3% each year, pre-agreed to in their various collective bargaining agreements. And some of those agreements are coming up for renewal, so it'll be curious to see what they end up doing in the future through those negotiations. But when we look back at our historical COLA since 2015, which was our first COLA where we implemented this CPI-based approach, not including fiscal year 23-24, but up until July of 2022, that averaged out to 3.075%. So we're holding that same average of 3%, but meeting our staff where they were from year to year, cost-wise. If we move forward with a 5.3% COLA for this year, the average would increase a little bit to 3.32%. So still very close in the ballpark with our peer agencies. And then the third factor contributing to this increased cost for salaries and benefits is that last phrase, our benefits. And some of these are elements outside of or where we have a little limited control, such as CalPERS. CalPERS has announced that there will be an increase to contribution rates starting July 1st, 2023. These increases are based on their actuarial reports from June of 2021 and the performance of the CalPERS portfolio at that time. The increase impacts both the authority's contributions on behalf of our staff, as well as the contributions that are deducted from our employee paychecks. The authority's contributions will increase by 1.52% for classic CalPERS members, which are members who enrolled before 2013, and 0.21% for the newer members who enrolled in CalPERS since 2013. And then last bit benefits wise is actually just our medical benefits. Our medical benefits are increasing. We offer a Kaiser plan, which will have an increase of 7.55%, and a Health Net plan, which will have an increase of 8.5%. Our dental is holding flat, and as is our life insurance, and our vision went down actually by 9%, but it's also only $9 a month. So that is as much as a decrease is nice to see, it's not a fiscally significant one cumulatively. Before I turn it back to Justina, because that was a lot I just gave you, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about the salary and benefit related elements and increases.
Elizabeth, can you say a little bit more about going from, what are we now, 53?
50s. Oh gosh, I know. I just was trying to look this up and remember my number better. Yeah.
So that
54,
sounds like a big
55.
jump.
Yeah.
When you say, oh, we're gonna go to 64 positions with the bulk of those in the field, could you talk a little bit about what the impact that is on budget?
I can. So I will try to as best I can numbers wise. So specifically in the field, I said, 2 full-time positions and 7 part-time positions. Those part-time positions, one of them is an intern level, which we've seen great success with bringing interns in to help expand our capacity. But the other 6 of them, actually, we're looking at public-facing open space aides to help with the opening of Mayano-Yakima and how we're going to manage our staffing to do all of our ongoing maintenance in the field and also meet the visitors where they are at the preserves to provide that experience and welcoming. So those are part-time positions. They're about 24 hours a week is the game plan. But with our pay plan, they are proposed I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but our current pay plan, they're $29 an hour, so add 5% to that. And so if you add that up though, the volume of headcount at part-time hours actually gets us a lot more impact in the field than just doing 1 or 2 additional open space technicians.
So your part-time employees get the full benefit as well, if it's more than 20 hours or no?
Our benefits start at a 30-hour. So these particular positions, they do get enrolled in the CalPERS benefits and they do get some portions of our paid time off benefits, but they are not eligible for the medical, dental, and vision costs. At 30 hours, an employee does with a prorated cost share.
When I started that, one of the employees was only 13.
When Justina and I started 8 years ago, we were 22 and people were looking at me saying, we'll never hit 50. And here we are. So, yeah. Any other questions? Okay, I'll hand it back to Justina for more.
Justina, are you about to go into the work plan or are you still on budget?
Just purely numbers today, no work plan.
Okay, because I did just want to piggyback on something Director Chapman just said, and it may be something we want to talk about with the full board about additional funding revenues. Do you have you've got the three-year historical budget comparison?
Not
I don't
yet,
have that. Do
not
you
yet.
guys have the budget in front of you?
Only a streamlined budget, because it's only numbers today, not what's in the work plan packet that you've got there.
Okay, so I'm looking at page 29 in the proposed budget, 3-year historical budget comparison. And where you see the biggest jumps are staff costs, a little bit in administrative operations. Field operations actually comes down a little bit, but stays pretty close to what it was in this last fiscal year, and a modest increase in public affairs. However, in the capital budget, land acquisition, capital structures, capital purchases, all those are the big ticket items, which in 21-22 was 12 million, in 22-23 was 8 million. In 23-24 is 6.7 million. So it's actually been trending downwards as we've increased the amount of grants that we've brought in. But that's still a big ticket item.
So question, so then the purchase land, so you have the yearly, so.
Yeah.
More land, what years we just purchased?
So land acquisition, we had a budget approved of 7.7 million in 21-22, 2 million in 22-23, and 3.3 million for this upcoming year recommended. And that's Matt and his team's best guess about what our respective contribution will be toward buying land when we join with our partners, when we bring in grants, etc. In the last couple of years, and I think Justine, you can validate this, we haven't always even spent the monies that we've allocated for land acquisition, which then becomes carryover for the subsequent year. However, because the biggest challenge for us is operations and maintenance, and you all know this, go over it again with the full board. When you have revenues of 12.7 million a year, and it's relatively flat. There's no COLA, there's no way to increase that over time. And your operations, the cost of doing operations, of managing land and staff salaries and benefits is going up. Those lines cross. So we're getting close to those lines crossing. What we can control is land acquisition, capital improvements, and so on. We could stop buying land. We could stop opening new preserves. We could not do new staging areas and so on. That's not a decision that we're recommending right now. But right now, we're bringing in pretty significant money from state grants that are paying the lion's share of those costs. But eventually, over time, we're gonna need more robust revenues because of the amount of land. So we're at about 30,000 acres now. We were at about 12,000, I think, when I arrived 12 years ago. And we'll bring on 5,000 more acres in the next year or two. So as I said, at the 30-year anniversary event, that's a 17% increase in the amount of land coming at us. So something has to be adjusted, and that's why we're starting to have a robust discussion about future revenue streams. And staff has done tremendous work. You know, we may want to share some of that with you, but we've done a lot of calculations about what our needs will be over the next decade, anticipating how much land is coming at us, how much staff will need to manage those lands, which of those lands would open to the public, would they have public-facing facilities. So we have a pretty good idea what our costs are going to be over the next 10 years. So then we tailor a funding mechanism to meet those costs.
Okay, so we've kind of addressed some of the changes in the salaries and benefits, admin operations, state. In my world, that's relatively level, considering, again, inflators to just costs of expenses going up. And then for conservation initiatives, we did see a big jump. It's mainly driven by 2 large non-capital projects that's going to be on the work plan and the cost of those projects, as well as the department itself setting up a new process of putting allowances aside for due diligence for any acquisition that they might not, like unforeseen acquisitions. So basically just setting a budget allowance aside. And so that has also increased on their ask for this upcoming fiscal year. Similarly with field operations. So the one little note, kind of wanting to also touch on what Andrea was saying about that little drop, is there's been a lot of changes in the field ops where one year they inherited the vets, the volunteer team, as well as the environmental ed, it went up. Then later we spun up the natural resources, so their expenses went down. So the historical data on that, there's too many variables affecting a good trend line. But all in all, it's pretty static in terms of field operations. We could kind of look at around the 2 million for maintaining our preserves. And in natural resources, again, I don't have any historical data. It's a brand new department, but this is the $1 million is their ask for their projects and their operations. Public affairs, a slight uptick. And then there is also for planning and capital improvements, the decrease, one of the biggest driver is that what was it? Actually, no. Planning capital improvements, we definitely had a more robust GIS program, so there's a programmatic cost involved. But then CV camp, one of the biggest drivers, CV camp expenses are now being captured as a capital improvement as we move towards the design phase. So in the previous fiscal years, it was kind of still in the conceptual, it was more outside services. It was non-capital, in accounting, it was not captured as a capital expenditure. And so that was that large $2 million amount, but
So you think that will be moved to somewhere else?
it would move down into the capital improvement line.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just the nature of accounting, how I'm capturing those expenses. And then for board, again, relatively leveled. And that includes stipends, training, any travel expenses. Those are typical of the board expenses. And then for this 23-24, an odd year, there are no expected election costs. And so that's that difference between the 2 years as well. Land acquisitions, again, that is mainly driven by data provided by Assistant General Manager Matt Freeman's data of anticipation of any acquisitions that might close in the upcoming year. That's the budget. It fluctuates. There is no trend line that I can ever foresee. And then capital improvement, it dropped because mine or Yakima is coming offline and into operations. And then capital purchases, yes.
What is that offline mean? Why?
In terms of the capital improvements being made, the expenditures, we're gonna be done when we open the preserve in July. Those expenditures to the contractor, the building contractor will be gone.
We're shifting from building to opening.
Mhm. Yeah.
Justina, what are the capital purchases? How do you differentiate those?
Typically, capital purchases, our threshold's a $5,000 threshold in accounting, but those are normally vehicles. Would be the main ones. That could also be any type of purchases for this building if it's a major HVAC revamp or
Okay.
it's basically a major purchase.
So it means we don't need any, I mean, the car or truck, right?
This year, when I look through the budget, no, not that I can see, or it didn't meet the threshold of capital purchase. Yeah. And so that's a comparison.
Justina, one other
Yes.
thing, could I just point out?
Mhm.
We have 15 minutes left. On the planning, you started talking about how, was it here or was it? We had, roughly 5.7 million. Is that mostly for CB camp? You're saying capital?
For planning's budget, last year's budget showing 2.1 and this year dropping to about 100K. Yes, it was mainly driven by CB camp having we moved it to capital improvement costs.
Yeah, and I don't know if you know the answer to this, but our staff estimated kind of an informed estimate of what it would take to do the Coyote Valley master plan at about 5 million. Is it higher than that?
Sorry, I do not know the
Okay.
answer of the project budget.
And as we speak, we are continuing to seek other funds from partners. So we got money from the Coastal Conservancy, we're getting money from the Wildlife Conservation Board, the Department of Water Resources, county parks, etc. So that's kind of a moving target. So we've got some of our own money invested in what it'll cost to finish the Coyote Valley Master Planning Project. But our goal would be that increasingly more of that money will come from partners and not from our kitty.
So actually that segues to my next slide. So while our budget, we're asking for about a little under 23 million, we're actually augmenting it with some grants. And so what our net expenditures, our kitty, is only 19 million. So, I also put a year-to-year kind of like last year's comparison as well. We've always been hovering in the millions for grants, and we continue to seek grant funding for those large projects because, alluding to Director Gill's comment, as hard as we try to kind of tamper down on our expenses, it really, the biggest help is finding outside funding to pay for those large projects.
That's an increase the revenue.
Correct. The path is to increase revenue. There's of course keeping expenses down, but at the same time, there's only a limit to how much we can keep it down. Because then it becomes non-discretionary, we have to pay it, there's certain expenses. And so with that, any questions so far before kind of just describing next steps? We anticipate bringing this to the board, the full board, on June 8th. It'll be a public hearing. And so staff does recommend if ABC has any feedback, and just to send the draft budget and work plan to the full board.
Madam Chair, anything that the Budget Committee think staff ought to explain more or be prepared to discuss, we're happy to take those items too.
The one thing that came to mind, because I'm thinking about conversations we've had when we talked about the revenue, there's a spreadsheet that kind of showed, you know, the trajectory. I don't know if everybody's seen that one or it's just, I don't know if you guys have seen it, but that might be helpful.
The trajectory of.
Where the operating and expenses
Mhm.
go.
Okay.
That spreadsheet, that might be. Because I think that in my mind, when I heard him going, oh, we need revenue, I'm like, yeah, and I'm thinking in my mind, picture, because it's going, like
Yeah.
you said, it's going that direction, so I think it's helpful
So,
to see kind of what those
so
projections.
you are talking about the line item, like even the payroll has all the
Right,
line
it's not,
items.
yeah, the operating budget
Yeah.
versus the revenue that's coming in, because it, again, like you said, it's static. And then, but if we take on more property, it's gonna,
That makes sense actually, it's a little bit, like me, I don't understand the budget and I can understand properly. One thing, the second thing, wherever you have the jump,
Mhm,
like, when you see the comparison,
mhm,
so you have to be just, bring that, prepare that slide also, why is the jump? So why this is before is less, more or than why is less and vice versa. And in that way, it's much easier for you to be explained. So when they have in the package, they already know that.
sure,
Not many questions.
okay,
Save your time.
yeah, you've done an excellent job answering all the
Good
questions.
job.
But I
thank
think
you.
it's just trying to decipher the different buckets and where
Mhm,
things go. This is my second budget, actually my third budget discussion of today, because I'm on another board doing, but we just did budget, we approved our budget for the foundation and then the city's doing it, and so. It's a matter of, yeah, what those line items mean and what the costs incurred under those line items are. I think that's helpful.
okay, thank you.
We can talk in-house as staff about how to make what adjustments to the presentation for the full board will want to make, but question I have for you is, would it be helpful to the full board to discuss some of the foundational assumptions first before we actually get into the budget? Like we have in the budget document, what District 1 is, what Measure Q is, what Measure T is, what measure, what the reserve is, and so on. But then also the trend lines and understanding that, is that beneficial to explain before we actually present the budget, or just in the kind of context of it?
I think so. And those questions may come up again, as we're going through it. But yeah, you could tell from my questions at the beginning, what
Mhm,
is the carryover versus the
Sure.
reserve, and do we have, a set amount? And I just didn't know what those
mhm,
assumptions were. And then I think it also does help to emphasize, as you did, when you started, it's 12,000 acres, going up to 30,000, going up to 5,000 more. And then we have to maintain that. And then the staff, when you started, was this, and it's this, and it's going up to this. And it makes it easier to see where increases
Mhm.
have to be.
okay.
Good one, yeah. I'll ask you the question later.
Well,
We
and-
don't have time.
No,
So,
and
I mean,
anticipating
all-
if there's public comment too, that's also
Yep.
helpful, right? Because the public's gonna wanna see what's
Mhm.
justified when those costs, so.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good job.
Thank you.
Okay, so this is, pardon me, where we had review and somehow we go to adjournment. So we will formally adjourn the meeting at 6:25.
Yeah.